We are talking about climate change, carbon emissions and global warming and various other aspects, but we are not addressing soil. Soil is the habitat upon which zillions of lives thrive. Once there is no richness in soil, then you have forsaken the planet in many ways. Every responsible scientist in the world and the UN agencies are clearly saying we have only 80 to 100 harvests left. That means approximately 45 to 50 years of agricultural soil left on the planet. By 2045, we will be producing 40% less food than what we are producing right now, and our populations will be 9.3 billion people. The food shortages that could manifest in the next 25 years, the consequences of that is unimaginable. Civil wars will unfold across the world once there is food shortage. What we are facing now is soil extinction. Why is soil becoming extinct? Where is it going away? What is happening to our soil? We must understand, if you add organic content to sand, sand will turn into soil. If you remove all organic content from the soil, soil will become sand. In normal agricultural soil, the minimum organic content should be between 3 to 6%. The most minimum is 3%. At least this minimum to keep the soil alive, to keep the soil as living soil is a must. Agricultural soils across the world, the depletion is so heavy, in most countries, more than 50% of the topsoil is already gone in the last 100 years. The nutrient levels have dropped significantly. The level of micronutrients you would get from your food in early 20th century to what you are getting from the same food now has dropped 90%. If you ate one orange in 1920s, what you got from it, now in 2020, if you have to get the same, you will have to eat 8 oranges. This is what we have done to our food.
Soil is the biggest ecosystem on the planet, and so few people know anything about it. 1 teaspoon of healthy soil probably contains more microbes than there are people on Earth.
The microbial life in the first 12 to 15 inches of topsoil is the basis of our existence. It is this magic beneath our feet which has produced the life that we are. This first 12 to 15 inches of soil is the basis of life for 87% of life on this planet, including you and me.
We have to begin to recognize that what we call our soil, Mother Earth, is a living organism.
Open soils, ripped open by ploughing, open to sunlight, is the basis of destruction of microbial life. So the focus should be on agriculture, the focus should be on seeing that land is under shade as much as possible, some kind of shade, grasses, herbs, bushes, trees. Conscious Planet is launching Save Soil movement to bring about a policy change to regenerate soil. As a part of this, I'm 65 and I'm riding 30,000 kilometers, a lone motorcycle journey, 30,000 kilometers across 24 nations to activate support from the citizenry to assure the governments long-term investments will be appreciated. So it's extremely important that soil regeneration is enshrined in the policy of every government on the planet. We must change the narrative on the planet that soil is a wealth, a legacy we have received from previous generations, and we have to pass it on as living soil for future generations. We are in a cusp of time. If you do the right things now, in the next 15 to 25 years, we can significantly turn this situation around and regenerate the soil. But if we allow this to progress like this for another 30 to 40 years, after 40 years if we attempt this, then it could take 150 to 200 years because that much loss of biodiversity would have happened. From 21st of March for 100 days, The whole world, every human being on the planet should talk soil. We must hear the word soil, save soil everywhere to see that the narrative on the planet changes towards the most vital aspect of our life, the soil. Each one of you should reach as many people as you can to make this happen. Many global leaders and influencers are already participating in the movement. Be a part of this and let us make it happen.
From my part, as much as I can contribute.
We're going to save the soil. Do your part.
And saving the soils.
Our future, our children's future, and our planet's future depend on it.
Save the soil.
We know what we must do, so let's make it happen.
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 Good evening, my name is Pagamani Kaba. I'm based at Kirstenbosch National Botanical Garden, and I'm glad to be moderating this talk of the expert of the panel of experts that will be having a discussion on art and human rights and gardens in general and in the environment. And I've got a few panelists that will be introducing themselves in a moment. First, maybe to introduce myself, I've been here at Kirstenbosch National Botanical Garden for the last 2 decades. I work with different plants, but I'm also interested in history, in arts, and also social commentary in general. And I've written different papers on and collaborated differently with different artists. Some of them here I see Zayan, you'll be speaking to later. She'll be introducing herself. And yeah, and when this chance came along, I thought, wow, it would be really great to have this conversation with a different bunch of people and try to sort of get some ideas going. So I'd like to give over the floor to our first expert and Maud, an old colleague of mine, and she'll be telling you more about herself. Over to you, Maud. Thank you.
Thank you, Pagamani. So, afternoon, everyone. My name is Maud. I'm a plant enthusiast. Quite a difficult word. So my background basically is in agriculture. That's how I got exposed to plants through working with plants in production. And then I moved over to Kirstenbosch to work with Pagamani and under the DEL, the Psychic DEL. And firstly, it began with me being in database, and then I moved on to learning about plants, but quite in a different way. I learned from the people who work with the plants in the garden specifically, and that's what Pagamani always encouraged. So from there, I got to understand how different people relate with plants and learn from plants. And moving on, then I went to go and do my master's with UWC, where I got to work with herders and to understand how now they understand plant, how they value plant, how they personify plants in a way that is quite, or that would be quite beneficial in the conservation space of plants, since they, like indigenous people, are the ones that get to understand plants, knowing from plants and learning from plants. So basically, I'm a social ecologist who's interested about people and how they relate with plants. Thank you.
Thank you, Maud. And I see we're really glad that James is able to join us. Welcome, James. I think we'll continue along with, maybe James can introduce himself at the end. We'll continue along with Tara to introduce herself. Sarah, please go ahead.
Hi, my name is Tara Weaver. I'm kind of tag teaming in for my comrade, Dr. Ali Hlongwane, who is unfortunately sick, but we co-authored a paper together, and we were colleagues at the City of Johannesburg for our sins. So my work is actually arts-based, but a lot of my research is focused around parks, and plants kind of increasingly. I did quite a lot of work around parks in Johannesburg, including recently digitizing and organizing the People's Parks Archive, which is an archive of park interventions that happened in Soweto between the 1970s and 1980s. And I have done quite a lot of research and work around the Joubert Park and the old greenhouse there, specifically looking at kind of the shifting sort of ideology that plants represent over time. So I'm definitely also a plant enthusiast, and yeah, a lot of my research, sort of personal research, is related to plants and parks. And I think that Bra Ali was going to touch on the Credo Mutwa Park in Johannesburg, so I'll touch on that. Although it has been a little while since we wrote that paper, so I might be a little bit rusty on some of those details.
Thank you so much, Tara. We look forward to hearing about your experiences. Maybe we'll go to Zayan.
Hello, everyone. Thank you, Pakamani. My name is Zayan Khan. My background is in horticulture, and then I went into landscaping, and then really focusing a lot on local indigenous and endemic plants, which was a focus in our studies. And because I'm based in Cape Town, kind of, as we know, and as Pakamani can attest, the botanical flavor around here is encouraged to be around indigenous and endemic plants, focusing on fynbos, but of course there are other biomes that exist here. And then I started supporting small-scale farmers through a land organization and various other land organizations around the country. And so the social, political, and kind of social ecological foundations or lenses were then very much a part of one of the most important parts of the work that I began to do some time ago, which included looking at what had happened to our food cultures in terms of indigenous food. And now, in subsequent years, it's been much easier to work as an artist, to do work from a more multidisciplinary, but as my friend Hanali Kutsia has taught me, more transdisciplinary way of working, which has made it a lot easier to share different solutions, or to come to different solutions for a lot of the issues and struggles that people and environments face. And so now the work that I'm doing as an artist is across the spheres of, or the nexus or connections of food and land and seed, And so I'm completing my PhD around our relationship with seeds. And seeds as a tool for transformation is one of the big chapters. So this talk is well timed. And the last thing I wanted to say was, so I've done so much work in this field. One of the most recent ones was with the Institute for Creative Arts at UCT. Myself and a friend of both Pakamani and myself, Melanie Bohi, have curated, I guess you can call it an exhibition of plant practitioners, people who were having, we call them plant translators, people who were engaging with plants in a different way, from dyeing to medicine to music. And also recently looking specifically at soil as a space for transformation by working with wild clay, and currently focusing on the clays out of District 6, out of basically the foot of Devil's Peak, what we now call Devil's Peak, and working with clay as a medium to share a lot of these stories. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Zion, for that introduction. I'll give a chance to James. Gentleman's last.
Thank you. So my work relating to this talk has been an intersection of art and plants and public space. And it came out of the last 8 years of restoring, as a volunteer, a 40-acre public space in Joburg called the Wilds, which is a nature reserve that had become really abandoned by the people of Joburg, and very much a colonial space. It was designed about 90 years ago and had fallen into disuse, partly because its location was right on the tipping point between downtown and the suburbs. So quite a challenge in terms of different socioeconomic groups bordering on the park with different perceptions of it, and all ultimately feeling alienated by it and not using it anymore. And I'm an artist, and I used my own art practice to make sculptures, which I installed in the park in a bit of a kind of guerrilla tactic way, to help to reimagine the space and to draw people back, which worked very well. And through my work in the Wilds, I got to know plants better, and I'm really self-taught in that respect. And the Wilds is unusual for a colonial era park because it was planted entirely with indigenous plants, which was very different to the fashion in those days, which was to bring an oak tree from Europe and a pine tree from North America and things from all around the world. So the Wilds is a remarkable asset in terms of plants, and I've had to figure out my own way around that because the city didn't provide any kind of horticultural oversight of the park. They'd completely neglected the plant collection, and it's become like very overgrown and taken over by weeds and just in a generally poor state. So by using art and coercing probably about 2,000 volunteers and fundraising, the park has been transformed. And I've recently used that knowledge to help design a new public park in Braamfontein for a corporate, which will open in the coming weeks. And I used a lot of the lessons that I'd learned in the Wilds in terms of how people navigate public spaces, appealing to different interest groups, how to make plants relevant, how to bring art into the whole experience of it, so it kind of shifts people's minds. And so now I've got involved in landscape design.
Wow, that's really interesting sort of background, James. I'd like to one day visit the Wilds there. I didn't even know that they exist. I'm a Joburger myself. I was born there, but I've spent most of my adult life in Cape Town. It's much better, but I'm sure the wild will make it memorable. Yeah. But
Wilds is the closest we have to Kirstenbosch in Joburg.
Yeah, I definitely look forward to visiting that space. So is the space, maybe just to start from you, is the space, how is the space currently utilized, who uses it, and how would you say it contributes to you know, the right to the environmental health and say health sort of aspects?
It's very popular now. If you go there on a weekend now, it's difficult to get a car park. There's like always a traffic jam to get into the Wilds car park. It's used by thousands of people every week. It's a very broad cross-section of people. You get little groups of kids coming from a school in Yeovil. You get suburban ladies coming to walk their dogs. You get yoga classes and meditation classes and hiking groups and old age walking groups and all sorts of different interest groups use it, which for me is very important because it has a broad appeal. It also means that then the park is used at different times of day and different days of the week, because what you don't want is an empty public space, because that invites all kinds of problems. What you want is a wide variety of users and for those people to interact in a positive way. So the Wilds suffered from a reputation of being a crime hotspot.
Yeah.
And completely reversed that without introducing any more security. There's still 2 security guards at the entrance, as there have been for 20 years. But what's different now, people who walk the Wilds, a lot of them are volunteers or have participated in some way in fixing up the park. So they feel they've got a vested interest in it. And they lead by example. So they pick up litter and they educate people. If they see a bunch of kids littering, they say, hey, excuse me, that's not okay. You need to behave like this. And so there's a way of people using the park, which is generally really respectful. And it's quite amazing. You can go to the Wilds at the end of a weekend when other parks in Joburg look like they've been hit by a bomb. And the Wilds is clean, like literally, like spotless. Because there's a culture of ownership, and that's been very deliberately led. Also, what I noticed is that people interact when they walk along. They see somebody else, they say hello. They have a little chat about, oh, have you seen this or have you seen that? Which is also important because it's eyes and ears in the park. You know, if somebody's feeling in trouble, they can call out and there'll be somebody around, or they can alert other people. So it gives a sense of community, which is really important. Yeah, I can't give you statistics. I don't know exactly how many people use it or what all their backgrounds are. We haven't done research. We don't have the resources to do that, and City Parks hasn't done it either. But the anecdotal evidence is a very broad base of users.
Okay, no, that's great. Maybe a general question, maybe that I would like to pose. Maybe Tara can respond to this. How probably your work relates in championing the environmental cause generally.
I mean, I think that in terms of kind of the environmental and conservation aspect, I think that Maud is probably the best place to answer that. But certainly, I can kind of respond on the note of parks and kind of a sense of ownership. I think that Johannesburg has kind of quite a complicated history with parks. I've just relocated to Cape Town, so I'm trying to like gauge what that relationship is now here as well. But I thought maybe I could read. Actually, I found this book today for 3 rand at the library book sale, which is beyond the headlines. And there's an interesting piece in here about parks that I'd maybe like to to read briefly
Please do.
to segue into the discussion about parks that I want to have. So she's talking here about picnics and parks. So one would wonder why kids prefer to go to the white spots when there are ever so many parks in Soweto. The answer is simple. They are not parks, but death traps. How many times have early risers stumbled onto corpses lying at Kozo Park in Rockville or at Mofolo Park? Mofolo Park is famous for people washing their cars, for secret lovers committing adultery in locked cars under the trees. For respectable people, it is unthinkable that you could go to Mofolo or to Kozo and have a picnic with your children. It does not even cross your mind. People do not see these places as parks in the same way that they see Zoo Lake and the other real parks in town. Mofolo and Kozo are just open spaces with trees and thoroughfares between townships. As for the Oppenheimer Park, that has never been seen as part of Soweto. It has always been for the white tourists to end their trip of Soweto by looking down at us from the tower. After 1976, the West Rand board blundered even more by giving part of it over to Credo Mutwa to create a Kaya museum of sorts. This is for whites on bus tours to visit. Local residents do not even know that this park exists. They see the tower and they believe it is a soldier's memorial of some sort. After living in Soweto my whole life, I only discovered this park in 1980 when I was taken there by whites who were showing a foreign visitor around. So I think it's pretty interesting for me because I've been, as I said, just kind of working on this archive, which is the People's Parks Archive. And this was kind of an interesting movement, which was related to kind of Operation Cleanup campaigns that were being initiated in Soweto by Jafta Lecheta, who was the founder of the National Environmental Awareness Campaign. And what you actually saw with this was a lot of community up parks being created. So again, going back to that kind of sense of ownership and a sense of community, it was very much a time where people were trying to take responsibility for their own environments, to create parks that served a function that they needed. And I think that this was highly threatening to the apartheid government at the time, because these parks were in fact sites of resistance and acts of resistance. And I think that, there were places where people built, for example, sculptures of Steve Biko, or they were titled things like Freedom Park. And these were very much kind of sites of disruption. And I think that what's interesting for me is how plants as well are kind of agents of disruption. They're disobedient, they get out of line, so to speak, which I think also, in saying that, we then identify them as kind of as revolutionary allies. They become kind of, I think, comrades in the the fight for transformation and for resistance. So I think that the Credo Mutwa Park, to be honest, the research that I was doing there was less related, I think, to the kind of the botany of it, and more to sort of the structure and its proximity to the Oppenheimer Tower. But yeah, so it was very interesting to see this passage in this book, because it echoed, I think, a lot of what I felt when I visited the park, and that there was a real kind of a disjuncture and a strange thing that happened with the Oppenheimer Tower being there, and then the Credo Mutwa village. So I would kind of like to, even though I feel like I've done my due diligence by kind of mentioning that park, I think that the People's Parks movement is almost a little bit more interesting to me. And some of the other research that I've been doing, I think, just in terms of the, as plants and soil as sites of resistance. Because what is quite interesting is that whilst these parks were being created by communities in Soweto, and we had Operation Cleanup, and a lot of school children, especially, getting involved in the 70s in actually clearing up areas and creating parks and artworks, sculptures, and so on. The Credo Mutwa village, the Kwakaya Lendaba village, was actually burnt down by a group of students, kind of in response to kind of comments that he'd made. I think Credo Mutwa was a pretty controversial figure. His collaboration with the West Rand Board of Administration, I think, is pretty non-transparent. So it's kind of like this interesting to juxtapose the two parks that were being kind of created at the same time, or the Credo Mutwa village, which is kind of in collaboration with the government, quite removed from the people, and then these people's parks, or peace parks as they were also called, which were being created by communities from the ground up. So yeah.
That's very interesting. Thank you, Tara, for sharing that. Talking about these spaces being transformed, dating from the colonial past, apartheid era past. I've always toiled with this question, and I've just posed it to anyone in the panel. How do we transform these spaces to be what we desire now? I mean, there's been a lot of really movements now that have been talking about decolonizing and so on and so on. But what does that mean to us, to this generation of people? What do we want to see? You did touch on it, Tara, and I think James did touch on it as well, but I'd like to hear maybe, let's see what Maud thinks about it, then we can open it up for more people to comment.
For instance, well, I would, in the Anthropocene, there's this word that anthropologists use, especially those that work with plants. They call it plant blindness. I don't know if everyone is aware of it, but then it's like something that I personally experienced while I was working at Kirstenbosch is when I got there, there's the scientific name of the plant, there's feed it this, feed it that, and then the plant will do better. But as I went on, especially when it came to learning from the uncle that I was learning from, Malumita Ndile, he taught me something about, how people have, plant blindness. They don't have a relationship with the plant, but they take care of the plant. And I also went on to experiencing it in fieldwork, when they took away the science, they took away the books, and I got to learn like from a phenomenological point of view, where I got to touch the plant, I got to smell the plant, and then I got to have certain relationships with the plant. And I think that's where it lags when it comes to learning from learning about plants at school and learning from plants while you are in spaces like Kirstenbosch, for instance. The more children got involved and the more we would communicate about plants with children, then this plant blindness, how can I say, people started relating more with plants when they engage with plants. And these are areas that current botanical spaces need to look into, instead of just teaching us or just showing us this is a plant, this is Encephalatus woodii, for instance. How do we relate with it? And the more we relate with it, the more we'll be able to participate as people in the conservation space. So that's what I would like to see moving forward.
Okay. Thanks, Maud. So it's the connection of the plant with the plant, which in turn will connect you to the soil, which in turn connects you to probably the space.
Absolutely.
Yeah.
Absolutely. I mean, you even hear millennials now, you can hear people say, I'm a plant mom, you know, and you find people relate with plants without even knowing their names, but just can tell, you know, my plant is not feeling well because of this, because of that, you know. And I think the more we work hand lens like with plants, then the more we get to learn more about plants or of plants. Yeah.
Yeah, thanks for that. This morning I had an interesting chat with an old colleague of mine who's based in Durban. And we were chatting about a project that some colleague done a paper about how in different municipalities, people, managers relate to biodiversity, what it means to this word biodiversity or conservation. It was a really interesting, I mentioned this because it seems so, there's this disjoint. If you say biodiversity to someone who's somewhere as an administrator in some, there's this disconnect about where they are exactly and how they fit in and how it could actually really give value to our society. But on that, I'd like to pose that same question to Zayan that I was asking more to answer earlier, and what it means. Please, so Zayan, yeah.
For sure. It's something I think about a lot. Because it's so, as decoloniality is and happens, I find it so difficult to unhinge myself fully because, you know, culturally, I am so hinged to colonial culture in the urban sphere, in the language I speak, in the technologies and the tools that I use. And so to try to not get too philosophical about it, but to be quite practical, a lot of it can be substantiated in our relations and our relationships. And so as Maud was talking about the way that we, you know, we might not know the science behind the plants, but we have the care for the plants. We might not, and that's one of the issues, is the taxonomy, right? It's the scientific basis of how things are named. And there's a lot of work that's been done to decolonize this and to recognize indigenous names, to recognize that in a lot of, and on that note, in a lot of the ways that we can engage in plants in other or older ways, we start to realize that the way that science or the way that we see plants and engage in plants these days is so singular that we see the plant as it is within its genus and species, etc. But when you unhinge that and you unfold the peripheries of that thinking and that culture, we see that plants are actually so much more than just plants, that there's a whole ecosystem, obviously, but there's a whole ecology that is based around that. But for humanity, or for us, when we, especially people who didn't grow up understanding plants or thinking about just natural world things, right? When plants are your lens, or when plants is your entry point, you very soon will start to learn about fungus, especially if it's in a space of care. You will start to learn about bacteria, if it's infection, if it's about, soil balance. You'll start to think about insects and meet insects and different animals. You'll have to think about the water and perhaps even the kinds of water, the geologies, the soils, the environmental condition. And so even like that, even as a simple practical way, is a very powerful tool in order to decolonize. But to get to specifically the question, that's also on the point of plants as agents of resistance, as Tara was saying. But Kirstenbosch is a good example of this, and I will say this loud and clear. There's a way that we consider natural spaces, but botanical natural spaces that are very well funded, where this is the path and this is where you walk. This is the lawn and you can walk or lounge here, but it goes nothing much beyond that. There's a demarcation of need. There are many rules and regulations. You are not allowed to pick up a stone or a twig or a seed that has fallen in these spaces. And so there's definitely this element, I had to write it down, that we have to peel away the colonial constructs that have conformed our understanding of these spaces, right? Which in this way, the botanical gardens or botanical thinking is underneath this banner of conservation. And so it's very much obvious that, as Frank Matosa calls, it's a militarization of conservation. These places are not for us. These places weren't made for us, because you can't, it's so pristine in many of the cases, and that is expensive. That kind of maintenance is very expensive. When we look at another botanical space like the wilds, like James was saying, it's not so pristine. And so there's more freedom and we feel more welcome. And we don't feel like we need to dress a certain way or we need this much money to get to, it's very difficult to get to Kirstenbosch, as we know. There's no public transport that way, because it was designed to keep some people out and allow some people in. These days, beyond race, it's about your financial means, which in South Africa, well, at least in the Western Cape, is still around race. So there's a lot of work that needs to be done, but I think fundamentally to peel that away, it's really about the way that we see what counts as a garden. A lot of people don't want, it's always about being on show. And it's fine to have dying flower heads, or it's fine to have weeds growing, because plants are, agents of resistance. So, and disruptors. And so somewhere in that, there's a possibility, but I think it's gonna require some generational change.
Thank you so much for those insights. I really like this term that I think it was Tara started using, this agents of resistance. It's a new term for me, a new sort of concept, but it's quite an interesting one. Before I give James another chance, these spaces, when I first, I'd say, came to Kirstenbosch almost 2 decades ago, it's a very different space from, it's the same space, but the context has changed slightly in terms of who comes here and what. It's evolving slowly. And it's really interesting in the last few years that we've been really attempting to engage and try to be more inclusive and to bring the broader community. As you know, Kirstenbosch, its history's got this horrid history of moving some of our workers that worked here at Kirstenbosch and dumping them in the Cape Flats 40 kilometers away, so that they can wake up at 5 o'clock and come and tend to the garden and drive back, pass them back. So there's this horrid history of this beautiful manicured space to what it is now. So in that context, I really believe that we can shape it to do something different. That's why we've been having these different, like Zion was saying earlier on, different festivals, looking at how the garden can be actually used by everyone to be much more inclusive, instead of paying quite a bit of money to come here and or being such a faraway space in general. I'm not sure, James, maybe you can pick up on this, on how, again, answering the question that the different colleagues have been engaging with. How do we change these and make them in the context of our new South Africa, in the context of what we want to see for this generation and the next generation in these spaces? How do we change them?
So I'm going to be a bit controversial here. I'm not a jargon person. I'm not an academic. I'm a practical person. And I think all the stuff about going on about colonial and blah, blah, is actually making a lot of excuses. Many of the worst parks I've seen have been built in the last 20 years. These excuses for a park where it's simply a bunch of lawn and some ridiculous overpriced gym equipment and 5 white stinkwood trees. Like, what we've got to look at is, how do we use our resources, whether they're old and planted a century ago or they were planted yesterday? How do we use those to foster a love and appreciation of plants? And that relationship between plants and people is what makes the spaces relevant and what will make sure they're looked after for the future. And I see this coming through with parks officials and a lot of landscapers as well. There's this kind of like dismissing approach towards people. It's like, oh, well, they won't appreciate it, so we'll just put acanthus down here. And so people grow up having only seen 5 kinds of plants. And this is crazy. And a very clever thing I saw at Babylonister is how they've done a herbal medicinal garden with really nice signage, and explains to people how plants can be used for health benefits. And this is a thing which I've learned a lot from the older generation in the wilds, is them teaching me about how plants can be used and traditional remedies and all sorts of things. And that makes plants relevant. You make them relevant by making them beautiful. So they're seductive. People love to be surrounded by them. You make them beautiful because they create shade, and that's relevant to people. And you make people appreciate it by, instead of sweeping away all the leaves and the dead wood and chucking them 20 kilometers away to the dump, you use them in the flower beds to restore the soil and to encourage fungi to grow. And people start to appreciate, oh, hang on, it's not just about a plant, it's about the wellness of the space around me, the soils and the quality of air and all of this. So we can do that, with better signage and things, but it's more about, I think, a more imaginative approach to designing the spaces or redesigning them. If we inherit a space that was created a long time ago, it's hard to evolve it, to make it relevant now, and to embrace, I think, a broader appreciation for nature that people had maybe a few decades ago. And then people will love the plants. But you've got to forge that relationship between plants and people, and do it in a deliberate way.
Oh, thanks, James, for that. When I first came to Kirstenbosch, I had spent some time in KZN. That's where I first studied, and I did this project called the Useful Plants Garden there, which sort of was my, later on, it enabled me to come to Kirstenbosch to do a similar sort of project in a bigger sort of space and a bigger context, and so on and so on. So the idea there was to what some of the things different people was touching on was to primary educate people about plants, connect with these plants, whether they are used for food, medicines, crafts, and so on and so on. Things that, many of the indigenous groups of people were using, or people who were there in that area were using generally. And I'm not sure, I was quite, a colleague of mine, Melanie, did a critic of that project. And I was quite, initially quite offended, because I said, we were trying to do this, educate the public about how to use these plants. And he said it didn't work. People don't see the space as really an absorption in terms of using these plants. They come here, they come and picnic, and they go away in there, but they don't use the plants per se in terms of their medicine in their, at least the group of people, our clientele that I was bringing this concept. So how, in that context, how do we frame these so that we are more inclusive, and we are more, we bring these spaces, like you were saying earlier on, about more people appreciate them much more, and they have this relationship. I think different people did say this in different ways, this relationship with whether it's the soil, biodiversity, or the environment. How do we always have signage to explain about this, or do we let people explore? Or earlier on, Zion was talking about these plant interpreters. I can see Maud is really itching to say something. Maud?
I was thinking that's a very good topic, because we were having a conversation about the useful plant section, and this again brings us back to plant blindness, because it's a section and it's written useful plants, and then we went into the naming of it. Was the naming because now, because somebody said, why can't it be ecosystem services? And another person asked, now, isn't that other plant over there useful, as opposed to this one? So these are type of the, barriers to understanding plants that people, people that are not in the plant sphere, because I understand ecosystem services. I know very well that, a pelargonium, for instance, how it's important for potpourri, and how it's important to take it from as a dead plant. It's important in my house because it helps my oak smell better or smell nice. These different types of ontologies that exist between plants, and that's very interesting. That why is it only there that you highlight the useful plants and the critique of it creating plant blindness?
So Tara, please go ahead. I'll respond to Maud later his question. Please go ahead. Oh, you're on mute.
I could really talk about these things the whole time. But I think that's like what you said now about kind of what is a useful plant, like really makes me think a lot about some of my favorite plants, which are weeds. I had a good book day today, so I thought my fellow plant enthusiasts might be interested in this. It's a weed dictionary that was published by May Baker Agrichem, so like a pesticide and weed killer company. And a lot of the weeds in here are like stuff that I know to be like useful or edible or indigenous. So I feel like the concept of kind of like what is a weed is like a shifting, it's also like a shifting discourse as well. And I think that that's something that you really also have to reckon with when you garden, because I was kind of like gardening at Jaber Park. Whilst I was doing research, I was gardening at the greenhouse. There's kind of it's like a community garden. Pretty much, if you come in there, you can ask for land. And I was kind of having to reckon with myself, because I was doing all of this research, trying to create kind of a catalog of all of the plants that had ever been in the park, and trace back, to when was like morning glory, for example, introduced. And this was a problem like that we had all the time in the park, was just like morning glory just takes over kind of everything. So I was kind of like having to sort of like reckon with the fact that like, like I love weeds, and I'm, kind of like wanting to like look at them and that they're useful and stuff, but then also as kind of like a gardener and like like a farmer who's trying to like set up some kind of a system there. They really can be kind of like agents of disruption as well. I also sorry, I would be very interested to maybe have even like a longer conversation with you guys about what like the complexities of the concept of indigenous when it comes to plants and indigeneity. I think it's a really complex one. On the one hand, because plants have come here with people, right? So if we talk about somebody whose heritage is Chinese, for example, there are specific plants that come over with those communities in order for them to be able to cook the food that they are, sort of like that they enjoy, and which is an important part of food safety, right? So it's kind of like, at what point do you say that plant is not indigenous, or it's not, or it's not local, or that it's alien, or that it's kind of foreign, because it is actually part of an ecosystem here. So that's kind of part one. And just thinking about like one of the weeds that I've seen in here, which is purslane, and remembering I had these Turkish neighbors in Johannesburg, and they spoke very little English, but we both loved our gardens, so we would always like exchange plants and seeds. And the old lady came out and she had this big bag of purslane, which I thought was like a weed always. I didn't realize that it was like an edible thing. So she would always kind of like come and like she would collect it, and she showed me how to kind of use it and so on. So just this idea of kind of like, what is a weed, what is indigenous, what isn't indigenous. And then for me, one of the things that I'm quite interested in is at the same time as kind of like the 70s, where you have this sort of complex engagement with parks happening and community parks, there is also kind of like a sinister side to plants that kind of comes through. As much as they are kind of agents of resistance and agents of kind of revolution, I think during apartheid, they also became kind of like agents of sort of like white nationalism. And there is a lot of like, it's interesting when you start to kind of look at it sort of like at a zoomed out sort of lens of like how many kind of articles and how much sort of fynbos and kind of indigenous flora and fauna were being really kind of pushed by South Africa as kind of like an alternative to because there was the cultural boycott and so on. But if you look at like, I think the first time South Africa participated in the Chelsea Flower Show was 1976. So it's interesting because there's this like real sort of like push on indigeneity and indigenous flora and fauna as this sort of like rallying symbol of almost kind of like a white nationalism that happens as well. So I think that there's so many kind of complex and interesting things around the concept of indigeneity and plants as kind of like actors, and agents of resistance, but also potentially of something else, right? Like they get mobilized. they get mobilized. And if we look at, the Kirstenbosch garden, it's also like plants and as like infrastructure, and how they act on us in those ways. Sorry, I hope I haven't talked too long.
No, not at all. We are running short of time, but to just pick up on what you said, is this famous saying about our former director, Professor Brian Rowcroft. During that time, when you say there was this Chelsea Flower Show, Kirstenbosch and the national government used to, if you see when they ratified CITES here in South Africa, it was around the same time when Chelsea and so on and so on. But Professor Roycroft famously once said, plants are apolitical. Sorry, that's my light going. Plants are apolitical. But obviously going to Chelsea was quite a big political statement and so on and so on. So maybe as a last sort of question, how do we use that in a positive way to bring people together rather than that what the Nets were doing? How do we bring communities together as plants, nature, soil, land? How do we connect people again to each other with this amazing biodiversity that we have in this country? So perhaps I'll give each person maybe 2 minutes just to wrap up with that. We can start with Zion.
The work of Denisha and Nant, who would have been part of our panel this evening, but could not join us due to sickness. That work that she's been doing with Princess Flay, for example, which is a wetland area here in the south of Cape Town, and other places, but it's a remarkable the methodologies that are being created where we're really looking at the plant-people relationships when it comes to areas of forced removal, and there's a push for some kind of, what is the word? Not rematriation, but where we have these open spaces that are at risk of construction. Sorry, I've just had a baby. I can't remember words. But using these spaces and highlighting these spaces as powerful places for reconnection. And a lot of the times the work starts with young people, with children, and the influence that children have on their families in these spaces, especially because in a society, in a city like Cape Town, which is based around apartheid spatial planning, and people have been forced off of their native land, which is close to the mountain or around or close to the sea or on the wetlands, and moved into kind of the flactus or the flats. These processes of reintroduction, of joining in when the seasonal seeding is happening, or when there are, what we now call rehabilitation zones are being implemented, and being introduced to the different species that also enjoy the same areas, the different, amphibians and birds and so on. This becomes such an important tool, and it's so simple, but effective. The other thing, quick, because I know I only have 2 minutes, is around introduction of food, and looking at and so now Tara, I'd love to talk to you for hours about this topic, but when we look at something like indigenous food in the Cape, it's very specific. We don't have the same geographic or botanical regions as the rest of the country have. It's very finite, it's very, and a lot of it is endemic. And so when you look at indigenous food done here in terms of plants, it's because it's coastal, and so these plants only grow here, or because they're specific geophytes, because we don't have a lot of grasses for grain seed as food. And so to understand indigenous food, you have to understand the environment, you have to understand the ecology and the time of year, because a lot of them are also deciduous. So there's something in both of those.
Thank you very much, Zayan. Let me give it over to Tara. Oh,
I really feel like I've kind of spoken enough. But I really think that I agree. I think that it's kind of like a practical sort of engagement. I really liked what Zayan said about kind of bringing sort of food in, and also I think kind of immersing people in the cycles of plants as well, and to create these kinds of personal relationships. I think, you know, what Maud was saying was so kind of poignant to me about plant blindness, where, you know, you can care for something, and you can kind of, without sort of really kind of engaging it. And I think that I don't know if I'm gonna get like banned from Kirstenbosch for saying this, but like when I was a kid, we had like an extremely small kind of yard, and so my mom would take us. We had like a year membership to Kirstenbosch, and my mom would take us there like all the time when we were kids. And my favorite kind of memories of that time, and so much of like the love that I have for plants now was built on being able to like touch and smell and eat as much as my would try to stop me. Like, you know, I was really kind of in there and engaging all of the senses. I remember like that weird, like that sensory kind of garden that spirals around. And when I was kind of too small to actually see sort of above it, and just kind of like moving through that space. And so I think that this kind of practical and physical and personal engagement, you know, that Maud and Zan and James, in terms of, you know, this kind of personal ownership of space, I think that that's key.
Okay, thank you so much. Let me give James a chance. James? James, you're muted. You're still muted.
Unmute, there you go. My last thought, I think, is about involving communities in these public spaces, because they're the ones who know what they want from it. They're the ones who are going to benefit from it. And I think a top-down government-y kind of approach of like, well, we know what is best doesn't work in local parks. And what I've noticed at the Wilds, and because many other people in other parks approach me, is this enormous wealth of knowledge and passion and interest about plants amongst kind of planty people like us. Often older generation, but also increasingly I'm seeing it with young people, even like young people living in flats downtown who have little plant collections in their balconies. If we are able to enable those people to participate in these parks and not have this authoritarian vibe that parks authorities have of like, oh, we're the ones who know what's going on. A simple thing that I've been trying to advocate for in Joburg is for the Parks Authority to stop mowing all the grass. They just spend millions and millions of rands mowing every blade of grass down to just nothing. When actually all you need to do is mow some areas for people to walk and have a picnic, but at least half of every public space should be allowed to just become wild felt. You know, wild felt is a beautiful thing, but this is actually, I suppose, a post-colonial thing, is that we inherited this approach that parks must be lawn, which is complete shit. So my feeling is by involving people who live in proximity to these spaces and allowing them to have a voice and to participate, then we'll start to bring life back into them, rather than being an extravaganza of lawn.
Thank you so much, James, for those thoughts. Maud, I think you have the last word. Oh, you're still on mute.
I think everybody has covered what I wanted to say, basically. Like, it has all been covered. And another thing that I also would like to see, especially from gardens themselves, is, yes, you are part of conservation. Yes, we're taking care of these plants, but there's also conversations like when we were with Melanie, with the plant interpreters, you know, we found out that there's actually conversations that are being held like within the garden, but then they're not reflected by the garden, you know. Like, for instance, I remember telling Melanie that Malume Tandile used to tell me not to go under the cycads after a weekend because people throw ashes on, I mean, they passed deceased family members' ashes on, like, on the cycads, you know. There's a whole different, that's a whole different like leg of it, and it happens within the space. But we never really hear about them, and they were surprised about it. I'm like, yeah. So Malume Tandile was protecting me and my spirit from the spirits that are there, you know, indicating that, no, I do this every day, I do that every day. So people who work in the garden, not necessarily the horticulturalist, but also the people who work there, you know. So yeah, that's my take. Thanks.
Wow, thank you for that, Maud. Thank you for those insights, everyone. I see in our chatter box we have a question that says conservation, colonialism, and access to land for informal housing is a conflict. How do we balance the need for space to live with the need for conservation? And when people are evicted from conservation, especially, I suppose there's always this dynamic. Do we value? I hear it even from a lot of some of my family members. They always say, "Ah, Pagamane, you too much of a tree hugger. You love rhinos. You love all of these things. You don't love people enough." How do we balance that generally? Is there a balance to be struck there, given our past and so on? But I think to answer this question, there's no just, we are all part of the environment. I know that we humans always see themselves as this external factor. I always believe that we are part of the system, whether destructive or not. We are part of this system. That balance and that understanding is reflected or by learning more about nature, and by understanding more about actually nature. I think that the biggest challenge is that we monetize all these things, as particularly nature as well. Those spaces, like I was saying earlier on, it's quite expensive to come to Kirstenbosch and so on. That is a challenge. If it were by me, or if it were, I would try and get these spaces, these green lungs, or these, that they are more accessible to people, free of charge. So yeah, that's one of the places that people derive that value, that educational value, and they connect much more to them. On that note, and I hope that if they do that, they learn to appreciate nature more, they connect with the land, and when they have land, then they can, treat it with, great respect, and do sustainable sort of practices on that land. So, on that note, I think we have gone past our time, but I think it's been a really a great conversation to have with everybody. Thank you very much for this opportunity for us all to engage and exchange our ideas and thoughts. And hopefully we can do it soon again, thanks to this platform of Artfluence Human Rights Festival for making this possible for us. And until next time, yeah, keep well. Thank you.
Think moments and memories. Make magic and movies. Share between sons and daughters, or just friends in their quarter. More music, more movement, more space for amusement, where history was made and the future is paved. Adventure awaits. Together, embraced. Just down the highway. Think Midlands, my way.